Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 Académie Culinaire de France Know-How Sharing Day. Today, I will present a little demonstration on one of the staple recipes that we all can use in pastry, cooking, and baking, which is puff pastry. And in a way, I should say, demystify what everybody think of the puff pastry dough and lamination. It's not that difficult, and with the proper understanding of the ingredients and their functional property, you'll quickly turn out some great puff pastry recipe. I also want to thank Jacqueline for hosting us on her platform, and Jacqueline will post the recipe via URL in our chat. So you can go to the chat and download the actual recipe. Will make it easier for you to follow through. So without further ado, let's start this demo, make it fun and educational. Let's first start by understanding the three different types of puff pastry dough. Classic method, inverted puff pastry, and quick puff. Each one done in a slightly different way. All recipe will be made of a détrempe, which will be the dough that we have right here, and what we call a butterbook, or butter, that will be laminated with this dough. For the classic puff pastry dough, we roll our détrempe into a square, insert our butterbook inside our détrempe, and close it. And after that, give it some turns, what we call bookfold. For the inverted puff pastry dough, we're going through the reverse method, where we actually mix the butter with some flour, roll our butter into a square, and fold in inside our détrempe. The détrempe dough goes on the inside, wrapped inside the butter, and then again going through the process of lamination and giving turns. That's the inverted puff pastry. The advantage of the inverted puff pastry dough is that it's a lot lighter, flakier, obviously a lot harder to do since you have the butter on the outside. The third method is our quick puff. Quick puff is not the quality and development of classic or inverted puff pastry dough, and it is mostly used for applications where you don't need all of that hard work, like tart shells or types of quiches, for instance. And the détrempe is made, and in the détrempe, we just incorporate large pieces of butter, which then gets laminated together, not in layers, obviously giving you a lot less of a layering effect and much more of a denser, richer and flakier but brisé dough in essence. For today's exercise, what I've decided to do is to give you a recipe that would enable you to do puff pastry in your kitchens that are oftentimes above 68 Fahrenheit, above 20 C, and give you some tips and tricks that are going to help you with that. And that recipe is the Viennese puff pastry dough. So let's get started and look through the ingredients and what they bring to this recipe. Let's go through the ingredients and understand the importance and their role. The first 6 ingredients are for our détrempe. This is going to be our dough. And these 2 ingredients, the butter and a small amount of flour, will be for our butterbook. In our détrempe, we will use sea salt, and the sea salt will bring us obviously taste, but also will help us to stabilize the water in the détrempe, the water in the cream, the water in the butter, which will provide us a better shelf life and also help coloration during baking. Then we move on to our vinegar, the white vinegar. White vinegar will help avoid oxidation in our puff pastry dough. And we all keep our puff pastry dough for more than 2 days. After 2 days, the puff pastry will start to turn a little gray. So a little bit of vinegar in your détrempe will prevent that. Vinegar will also help tenderize the gluten in the flour in our recipe, which will therefore not overstress the dough during the lamination process. We then move on to our liquids, our cold water, our cold cream, and egg yolks. The obviously liquid are here to hydrate the flour, and we have a combination here of cream and yolks, which you typically don't have in a traditional puff pastry dough, and that's what makes it a Viennese puff pastry dough. The butter is obviously an important part of the puff pastry dough. Here we're working with a 37-38% butter in this Viennese puff pastry dough, so something very rich, surprisingly light and flaky for that amount of butter, and we'll understand what a little bit further. And some flour that we will mix with our butter. This will be one of the tricks that I will talk about, or will help you make puff pastry in a warmer kitchen. I prefer using filtered water. Filtered water will help you remove the chlorine and the hardness, typically in tap water. If you don't have a filter on your main line, you can simply filter it through one of this water pitcher, very easy. Butter is an important part of the puff pastry dough. We have a 37-38% butter fat content here in our Viennese pastry, which surprisingly still very easy to work with, since we will mix it with a little part of the flour to make it of a higher melting point. You always want a high fat content butter fat. 82% is your minimum fat content. You don't want anything less than that. It's better if you can find an 84 and 86%. 84 or 86% are typically the result of winter feeding, where the feeding is drier than grass-fed. This results in a much drier butter, and that butter has a higher melting point. Typically, you have a 27-28 melting point for regular butter versus 32 to 35 C for dry butter, so making it a lot easier for lamination process and when you work in warmer kitchen. Last but not least, the flour. The flour, with what's crucial is its gluten content. Here in the recipe, I have two different types of flour. I like to use an 11 to 12% protein or gluten content for the détrempe, while I use a 13 to 14% gluten content flour for the butterbook. Why? Well, the gluten is important. If you don't have enough gluten in your puff pastry, you're not going to weave that a gluten matrix, which is basically the weaving of what will give you the strengths in the puff pastry dough, and avoid that it collapse during baking. But if you have too much gluten, then your dough will be tough, hard to work with, and not as flaky. By using an 11 to 12%, slightly lower protein content in my détrempe, I prevent some elasticity, and I get a détrempe that is nice and pliable and very easy to laminate, while I can increase the gluten content in my butterbook, since the fat will coat or grease that gluten, and it makes it harder for those links to be elastic. So now it's time to make the détrempe. We first put our salt inside our mixing bowl, add the vinegar. Next, I'm adding the cold water. Make sure that I dissolve the salt so that it's not showing in my dough. Next, the cold cream, 35% fat cream. It's important to respect the amount of butter fat in the cream. We'll talk about it in a minute. And the egg yolks. So you noted that the egg yolks, the cream, and the water were all cold. And that's going to be important, along with the lower gluten content in our détrempe, which helps having a détrempe that is not too elastic and makes it easier for lamination. Having the liquid very cold will also retard the gluten matrix development, which will anyway take place during the lamination. So it's key to not have that elasticity or too much of that elasticity in the détrempe at first, since you will have it through the lamination process anyway. So that's why we work with the very cold liquid, and that's also why we work with a lower protein content in our détrempe recipe. Now I'm adding the lower protein content amount of flour. I'm going to mix the détrempe using the hook attachment on low speed and simply until well combined. We now have our détrempe dough, which we're going to shape into an even dough. Just kneaded it a little bit. Again, no need to develop the gluten matrix in our détrempe. And what I'm going to do is cut across through that dough. I don't want to cut wide. I want to cut deep, kind of narrow, not that wide, so that the dough will have to work and release that tension. If I cut not deep enough and too wide, the dough will right away open up and there'll be no release of tension. So that's another good trick to avoid having that elasticity that you don't want in your détrempe. We've added a certain amount of fat in our détrempe, and this 10% fat content, butter fat content in our détrempe is what helps us, what we call grease or coat those gluten links. So once you've cut the cross, dipped and not wide into your détrempe, you'll simply wrap it in Saran wrap and refrigerate it for a minimum of 2 hours, preferably overnight. So let's talk about gluten links. Gluten, also known as vital wheat gluten, is made of links. I'm just gonna draw a little exercise here for you to understand. All those little links, once they find each other, they actually connect to create that gluten matrix and link that will give you the elasticity and extensibility that we have with a gluten matrix. And when we add butterfat in our détrempe, essentially what we do is we coat this link with some fat, butterfat here, so it makes it harder for the links to become as elastic and resisting that they would without any fat. So that fat still enables them to connect, but not to overstress the dough and give you too much of that elasticity and resistance. The gluten is mainly made of what's called gliadin and glutenin. And gliadin is responsible for the extensibility of the dough, so how far you can actually stretch it, while glutenin is responsible for its elasticity and its resistance. Now we're going to simply mix our butterbook with the higher gluten content flour using the paddle attachment on low speed and simply until well combined. Now we're going to use this butter and form it into a nice rectangle shape to get our butterbook ready. Time to wrap our butterbook. We have our butter and flour mixture here on a piece of acetate. simply fold square here. Get some nice straight angle to get into the corners. Same on the other side. It's a nice and easy way to get the butter into the right shape. Once you have it nice and even, just pick it up and refrigerate it for 2 hours, preferably overnight. So let's remind everyone what we are going to do here and go through the motion. Remember that we've made our détrempe. So this is our détrempe dough, the base dough that is resting for 2 hours or preferably overnight. We're going to roll it into a square and then place our butter in the center, wrap that butter, making sure that we are really on the corner here, that the butter is really meeting the dough and there is no gap or space or missing amount of butter or missing amount of dough. It has to be perfectly fit, snugged, and with right angle. We'll talk about it in a minute, but that's very important. And once we have our butter wrapped in our dough, we're then going to roll this puff pastry dough into a longer rectangle. This is our détrempe dough. The butter will then be in the middle, trapped and wrapped in between the layers of dough. This long rectangle is going to be 3 times longer than its width. So 1, 2, 3. And we're then going to fold this into turns. There are 2 kinds of turns. There's a kind of turn that it's called the single turn, where we will fold our book into thirds, like so. That's a single turn. And there's a kind of turn that is called a double turn, where we then fold our book into fourth. Go in the middle, like so, and then fold it again. Depending on the kind of turn that you use, you get different amount of layers. But before we get into the turns and the layers, I want to tell you a little more about what makes a successful dough and the perfect lamination. The perfect lamination is nothing other than distinct layers of dough and butter. Those layers have to be one on top of the other, very nice and even, so that during the baking process, the layers of dough will create steam that will rise and push the layers of fat up, characteristic to the puff pastry. So here again, if we go with single turns, which are folded in thirds, and if I do that exercise to cutting through the layers for you to clearly understand layers, you'll see that we have a layer of dough, a layer of butter, a layer of dough, and another layer of dough which combines with the other, a layer of butter, a layer of dough, on top of a layer of dough, a layer of butter, and finally a layer of dough. This will give us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 layers for the first single turn. If I proceed with a double turn, same principle, my butter is in the middle, wrapped in my détrempe. I will fold it in half. Unfold it again, which will give me folded in quarters. I cut through the layers. Once again. Now for a double turn, I will have a layer of dough, a layer of butter, a layer of dough on top of a layer of dough, still making one layer, a layer of butter, a layer of dough on top of a layer of dough, a layer of butter, a layer of dough on top of a layer of dough, and again a layer of butter and a layer of dough. So with a double turn, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 layers. So if we were cutting through the dough, we now understand that we have 4 layers of dough, 3 layers of butter, for a total of 7 layers per single turn, versus 9 layers for a double turn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 layers of dough with 4 layers of butter. So now that you have a pretty good understanding of single and double turns, to make puff pastry, you need a minimum of 4 single turns, and you can go up to 6 single turns. But it's important to understand the difference between 4, 5, and 6 turns then. To understand that, here we can see on paper how many layers which each single turn give us in puff pastry dough. I've showed you that first example so that it made sense for you, and you had a visual that we had 7 layers for our first single turn. It's easy to understand that after that, each time you give another fold, you will fold again 3 times those 7 layers and jump from 7 to 19 to 55 to 163 layers for 4 turns, which is the minimum you need for puff pastry dough and proper development. However, oftentimes people are confused between, do I give 4 turns, 5 turns, or 6 turns? Well, here it's easy to understand how quickly you go up with the layers, and that's a tremendous difference between each one of those terms. Either that you go with 163 at 4 turns, 487 at 5 turns, or 1,459 with 6 turns. It's kind of like the stock market when it works really good. Compounds, boom, 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 boom. 7 turns would not work, and that's what I'm about to explain. While you need a minimum of 4 turns, you can only go to 6. And I have made 3 books of puff pastry dough and cut a slice of it at 2 turns, at 4 turns, and at 6 turns, so that you could see the difference in between each sets of 2 turns, which is how we will proceed when we do the turn. So here we have a cut of a puff pastry book, cut at 2 turns, at 4 turns, and at 6 turns. And through this exercise, you can clearly see that the layers of butter and dough are very distinct and obvious at 2 turns, that they become thinner at 4 turns, and even thinner at 6 turns. This will have an important role during baking, since during baking, the layers of dough steam, the water evaporates and push up as it steams the layers of fat. While we know that we cannot do a puff pastry dough with less than 4 turns, there's a tremendous difference in between 4, 5, and 6 turns. So it's easy to, if you focus on 4 and 6 turns, see how much thinner the turns are becoming with 6 turns, which will result in less development. A puff pastry with 4 turns will develop more, since the layers are thicker in between the butter, than a puff pastry with 6 turns. That will not develop as much. However, that puff pastry with 6 turns will be a lot lighter, a better crisp, and a lot more flaky, will be flakier. So depending on the application, if you want to do a vol au vent and pastry items that will be filled with sauce, and you want it to rise high, you will do 4 or 5 turns. If you want something to not rise so much but get the super flaky end products and be light, or you don't want something to develop so much, like wrapping, for instance, a beef Wellington or salmon in crust, then you will use a 6-turn puff pastry. So we're gonna get a close-up of this for you. Here is our 2 turns lamination cut. Here is our 4 turns lamination cut. And here is our 6-turn lamination cut. Now it's time for the lamination. We're gonna place this butter inside of the trompe and give our first single turn. Let's get our détrompe, our rested. You could see that the dough is very easy to roll, very pliable. What's needed for flour, not anymore. We don't want to add a lot of flour to this dough, just as what it needs. Make sure you have proper amount of dough to reach the center, and then place your butter. In the center. You don't want excess dough here in the corner. You want to make sure that when you fold it, really gets to that corner. There's a little bit of overlap here, and then a little bit of overlap here, but there's no excess here on your corners, because you want those layers to be as even as possible. You don't want an excess or a lack of butter in between the dough and the butter. You want it to be very even. Because remember, every time you're going to give a turn, you're going to repeat that lack or excess of butter in every single layers, up to 1,459 layers for the 6-turn puff pastry. So that's when you'll have an uneven rising, if there is an uneven distribution of butter and dough. Kind of temper that butter at first so that it gets a little more pliable. You have to take that butter out, that butter book out, for probably 20 minutes, 30 minutes, depending how cold or warm your kitchen is, prior to putting it in the dough. If your butter is too cold, it will crack and create spacing in between your dough and the butter. If it's too soft, it will ooze out and come out. Now we have our dough rolled 3 times longer, width times 3 for a single turn. One good trick is that if one of the sides is not enough of a right angle, take that side, trim it slightly, reserve, fold that side that had the uneven side, and use this to fill the gaps so that you will start with a very even first turn. If you start even, it will remain even. But it's important on the first turn to make sure that everywhere you have all of these layers. If there is a hole here, it will repeat 1,459 times. And that's why your puff pastry will not rise evenly and as high as it should. There'll be a lack of steaming in between layers where you have a gap. Always bring the fold to the right before you roll for the second turns. This way, you will stretch the dough in this direction, and since you're turning in a quarter turn, in the other direction, and after that, you will get another quarter turn, go this direction, another quarter turn, and 6 times like that, so that the dough is stretched in all directions. Otherwise, something round will then bake oval and like a football shape because it's been stretched only in one direction. So once you've done one turn, you're going to go and roll the dough again for a second turn. What I like to do when I do this, a good trick, is I like to cut through this side and through this side here. This is loose, this will laminate pretty easy, but this is closed and closed here, so there is some resistance, and it's becoming a lot more elastic because this is not letting me sheet the dough because it's not cut. There's a lot more resistance and stress here. So if you do slice through that resistance here, and on the other side through that resistance right here, it will make it a lot easier for you and not stress the dough and overwork that gluten for any kind of laminated dough, puff pastry, croissants, danish. Could be yeasted or not yeasted. It's a good trick for both of them. So we have our second turn ready. 1, 2, 3, same concept, single turn, one fold. Making sure we are nice and straight, but because we adjusted with the first turn, it should carry on now and never go out of line and out of right angles. And now we have our puff, beautiful fold, number 2, nice, even, regular. We're going to mark on the top and right corner slightly, not puncturing the dough, that it has 2 turns, so we know. And I'm already going to do that same trick, which is cut through the layers right away so that I don't forget. And when I go for the third and fourth turn, again, it'll be very easy to go through it. To wrap this book, inside wrap. So once we have wrapped this book, we're going to put it in the refrigerator to rest for a minimum of 2 hours. So now that you learned that you could do either single or double turn, and that a single turn will give you 7 layers and a double will give you 9, you can actually play and combine those kinds of turns. A double turn, because it's folded, remember, in halves, and then again folded, so give you fourth, versus a single turn that is folded in third, is a lot harsher on the dough because it has 4 fold. So you can't do too many double turn through your lamination process. It will be too demanding on the dough, overstressing the dough. A single turn, while it's not as stressing, 6 of them becomes cumbersome. It's a lot of work, and it also builds on the stress of the dough. A double turn accounts for a turn and a half, for a single turn and a half. Since it has 9 layers, it's not quite exact, but it's 9 versus 7. With a double turn, you actually get 1.5 single turn. So in essence, if you do a combination of both for a puff pastry with 6 turns, you could do 2 double turn and get 3 turn, and then do 3 single turn, for a total of 6 with only 5 turns. That's the best of both worlds in terms of layers and alternating the turns that are not overstressing the dough. All turns are done in sets of 2, either 2 single turns or double turns are never done in sets of 2. When you add a double turn, it's always a double turn with a single turn, because again, double turn being harsh on the dough, it's better to pair it as a set with a single turn. So you will give, for the example I give you, a double turn with a single turn, another double turn with a single turn, and then 2 single turns for a total of 6 turns. They're done in sets of 2 because when you get the dough out of the refrigerator after 30 minutes of rest, the butter is a little cold, not pliable, not quite pliable, or at least not at the optimum pliability. So that first turn of the sets of 2, get that butter ready, which then that second turn, get it when it's at its best. Then the butter gets too soft again, and that's why it goes again and rest for another 30 minutes before the next sets of 2. We're now ready to cut out our puff pastry dough. This has been sheeted after 6 turns to 2 millimeters, so very thin, 2 millimeter thick puff pastry sheets here. And when you cut, you don't want to smash the layer or pinch them. So the best is to cut with either a very sharp knife or an X-Acto blade like so. I place my puff pastry in a freezer for just a few minutes before I cut it. So I make sure that it will not, again, smash the layer together. Here I'm just going to cut some plain rectangle for the exercise so that you can see after the baking the results of all of our work and of all those little tips and tricks. Time to egg wash these little babies. So be very careful when you egg wash to not egg wash the sides, just the top, not the sides. I like to go one way, pass it, and then come the other way or the other side, making sure that I don't drape on the side. Otherwise the egg will bake and actually glue those layers that you work so hard at building. And if those layers are glued on the side, they will not be able to expand. They will be glued together on the side. So after you've egg washed your product, always let it rest for a minimum of 30 minutes, refrigerate it for 30 minutes before baking. Baking will have to take place in a fairly hot oven, about 180 to 190 Celsius, which is about 375 to 400 Fahrenheit. I would say 375 in a deck oven versus 400 in a 375 in a convection oven, and 400 in the deck oven. 400 in a convection oven, it's a little too high. Now the fun time, and we can see the result of our hard work. This is the puff with 4 turns, so we see a lot of development, thicker layer, more steam, pushing the layers up, versus here our puff pastry with 6 turns, a lot less development, as you can picture and feel just looking at it, a lot flakier, a lot richer, and also a lot lighter. And it's a pretty good development considering that this is only with a 2 millimeter puff pastry sheet. So you could see how this 2 millimeter, if you respect all of the tips and tricks I gave you, can develop as much as this much for a 4 turn or even for a 6 turn. And finally here, if we cut through, we can see the inside of a 4 turn puff with a lot of development and a lot of steaming in between layers, versus a 6 turns here. A lot more compact, but a lot of flakiness when you bite through it, and much more appropriate to, again, beef Wellington, salmon in crust, or pies. Hope you enjoyed making the puff pastry and looking forward to catch up with you in the Q&A session.